He said he did it. But the more evidence police uncovered, the less the story made sense. But before we proceed, don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Drop your location in the comments. We want to know where you're listening from. This is Silence After the Screams, your weekly dose of spine and chilling true crime. Like and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. No one was supposed to die in that apartment. That is what everyone said at first. The neighbors, the teachers, the family, the police officers who stood frozen in the hallway, staring at a scene they would never forget. It was just past 11 at night when the call came in. A young voice, calm, shaky, and disturbingly clear. "My mom isn't breathing." The dispatcher asked questions, the kind they always ask. "Where are you? Are you safe? Is anyone else there?" And then the voice said something that changed everything. "I did it." The apartment was quiet when officers arrived. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. A baby was crying somewhere inside. Soft, weak, alive. They found Marina Alvarez in her bedroom, a young mother, recently home from the hospital. Her life ended where she was supposed to feel safest. Her newborn daughter slept in a crib just feet away, untouched. And standing outside in handcuffs was Lucas Alvarez, 13 years old, honor student, quiet kid, no history of violence, no trouble at school, no warnings, no explanations, just blood on his clothes and a phone still warm in his hand. To the outside world, Marina's life looked full. She worked from home, took care of her children, smiled in photos, laughed in videos. Friends described her as gentle and patient, protective of her son, overjoyed about her newborn daughter. Lucas had just started 8th grade. Teachers praised him. His grades were strong. He liked video games and drawing. He talked about becoming an engineer one day. There were no reports, no calls to child services, no signs of abuse, no known conflicts between mother and son. That night was supposed to be ordinary. Marina fed the baby. Lucas said goodnight. The lights went out. Nothing about that evening suggested it would end in horror. The emergency call would later be played in court, slowed down, replayed, dissected word by word. Lucas sounded detached, not hysterical, not screaming, just factual. He said his mother had been stabbed. He said the knife was in his room. He said there was a gun in the house, but he wasn't holding it. Then came the question no one expected. Why did you do it? There was a pause, and then silence. Investigators described the apartment as clean, organized, almost peaceful, until you reached the bedroom. That was where the story changed. There were signs of a struggle, blood where it shouldn't be, a weapon left behind, drawers opened, items moved, evidence that someone had walked calmly through the home after the attack. The baby monitor told its own story. One image showed Marina earlier that night, leaning over her daughter with a tired smile. Another image, taken later, showed a figure standing over the bed. A figure investigators said looked like Lucas. At the station, Lucas waived his right to a lawyer. He spoke openly, too openly. He said he went to the kitchen, took a knife, walked into his mother's room. He said she was asleep. He said he attacked her. He said he took photos afterward. He said he sent them to a friend online. Then he stopped talking. When asked why, he froze and asked for a lawyer. From that moment on, nothing was simple anymore. How does a 13-year-old plan something like this? Why would a child with no violent past suddenly commit such an act? How did he know where to strike? Why did his phone history show disturbing searches hours before the crime? And most importantly, why were people already saying he was innocent? By morning, the case had exploded across social media. Some called him a monster. Others called him a victim. And a movement was forming that would divide the public in ways no one expected. Because the more details emerged, the more one terrifying possibility began to surface. What if the story everyone believed wasn't the full story at all? By morning, the case was no longer just a police investigation. It was a public spectacle. News vans lined the street outside the apartment complex. Reporters repeated the same words over and over again, trying to make sense of something that felt impossible. a 13-year-old boy accused of killing his own mother. But almost immediately, the narrative began to crack. Detectives replayed Lucas Alvarez's interrogation again and again. At first glance, it sounded like a confession. He admitted to being there. He admitted to holding the knife. He admitted to calling for help afterward. But the more experts listened, the less certain they became. Lucas's language was strange, clinical, almost scripted. He described actions without emotion, as if he were repeating something he had been told, rather than something he had lived through. When asked follow-up questions, his answers became vague. When pressed for details, he contradicted himself. He knew what happened, but he struggled to explain how. And he could not explain why. Investigators turned to Lucas's phone. What they found was disturbing. Searches about violence. Videos that no child his age should have seen. Messages exchanged with people online whose identities were unclear. There were photos sent shortly after the attack, blurry, shaking, taken from inside the apartment. To police, this looked like guilt. To the defense, it looked like panic. Why would a child who planned a murder call for help immediately afterward? Why would he stay at the scene? Why would he hand over the phone without resistance? The answers didn't line up cleanly. Then Lucas's family broke their silence. They stood in front of cameras, their faces tight with exhaustion and disbelief, and said the words that changed everything. He didn't do this. They insisted. Lucas was gentle, sensitive, afraid of confrontation. A child who cried when animals were hurt. A child who panicked easily. They pointed to Marina's recent struggles after childbirth, to exhaustion, to stress, to moments that were never reported, never documented. They didn't accuse anyone outright, but they asked a dangerous question. What if something happened that night, and Lucas didn't understand it? Prosecutors leaned heavily on one piece of evidence. The baby monitor. The footage showed a figure entering the bedroom. The shape, the height, the movement. Police said it was Lucas. The defense argued the image was too grainy, too distorted, too unreliable to prove anything beyond doubt. Experts disagreed. Analysts argued over shadows, angles, and timestamps. What looked clear to one person looked uncertain to another, and that uncertainty grew louder with every hearing. Lucas was charged as a juvenile, but prosecutors made it clear they were considering harsher penalties. The courtroom filled with tension. On one side, the state argued premeditation, planning, and intent. On the other, the defense painted a picture of a frightened child caught in something far bigger than himself. Psychologists were brought in. Some said Lucas showed signs of emotional detachment and possible violent ideation. Others said he showed signs of shock, confusion, and dissociation. Two interpretations of the same behavior. Two possible truths. Only one verdict. Online, the case exploded. Hashtags formed overnight. Some demanded justice for Marina. Others demanded mercy for Lucas. People analyzed every frame of video, every word of the interrogation, every pause, every breath. Strangers became experts. Everyone had an opinion, and somewhere beneath the noise, the real question remained unanswered. What truly happened in that bedroom? As the trial approached, investigators uncovered one final detail that refused to fit neatly into either side's story. A piece of evidence that suggested the timeline might not be as simple as first believed. A moment that could change everything, but acknowledging it would mean admitting that the truth was far more complicated and far more uncomfortable than anyone wanted to accept. And once that door opened, it could never be closed again. By the time the trial began, the courtroom felt less like a place of justice and more like a battleground. Every seat was filled. Cameras waited outside. Reporters whispered in the halls. Everyone believed they already knew the truth, but no one agreed on what that truth was. At the center of it all sat Lucas Alvarez, small in a chair built for adults, feet barely touching the floor, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He did not cry. He did not smile. He looked like a child who had aged years in a matter of months. The prosecution presented their case with confidence. They described a child who had grown obsessed with violent content, who felt overwhelmed by responsibility, who resented the sudden arrival of a newborn sibling. They pointed to the phone searches, the messages, the images sent after the crime. They played the emergency call. They replayed the interrogation. They showed the baby monitor footage again and again, pausing it at the exact moment the shadow entered the bedroom. This was not an accident, the prosecutor said. This was a decision. To them, Lucas knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway. The defense told a very different story. They described a boy who lived in confusion, fear, and emotional overload. A boy who lacked the maturity to understand the weight of his actions, or even the reality of what had happened. They brought in psychologists who explained dissociation, how the brain can fragment under trauma, how children can repeat details, fed to them by authority figures, without fully grasping their meaning. They questioned the interrogation itself. Why was a child questioned for so long without a parent present? Why were leading questions used? Why did his story change only after hours of pressure? They argued that the confession was not proof of guilt. It was proof of vulnerability. Then came the detail no one could ignore. A discrepancy in the timeline. A gap between when the baby monitor recorded movement and when Lucas was documented entering the room. A moment that did not conclusively place him at the scene when the fatal act occurred. It wasn't enough to clear him, but it was enough to introduce doubt. And doubt is dangerous in a courtroom. Lucas's family took the stand. They spoke of the boy they knew, his fear of blood, his anxiety, his inability to harm even small animals. They spoke of Marina's love for her son and how she would never want him destroyed by something he did not fully understand. Their voices broke, not in anger, but in grief, because no matter the verdict, they had already lost everything. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated. Hours passed, then more. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. Lucas was found responsible, but not in the way many expected. He was adjudicated as a juvenile, sentenced to long-term confinement in a secure treatment facility, rather than adult prison. The judge spoke carefully. "This court recognizes the severity of the crime," she said, "and the complexity of the mind involved." There was no cheering, no sense of relief, only a heavy silence. Marina Alvarez was laid to rest. Lucas was transferred out of public view, his future sealed behind locked doors and clinical language. The apartment was emptied. The baby was placed with relatives, growing up far away from headlines and court transcripts. But the case never truly ended. Years later, people still argue about what happened that night. Some believe justice was served. Others believe a child was lost to a system that needed certainty more than truth. And there are those who believe the full story was never told at all. Because some cases don't end with answers. They end with questions that follow you. Questions like, what if the truth was more fragile than guilt or innocence? What if no one fully understood what happened? Not even the person at the center of it. And what happens when a child's life is defined forever by a single night? No one can fully explain. This was not just a story about a crime. It was a story about doubt, about how quickly the world demands explanations, and how sometimes the most disturbing truth is not what we know, but what we may never know at all.